Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and this time around, I'm going to be talking about my top 10 storylines. I almost said 10 favorite, and that's mostly what this is. I love the versatility of the word top when you have a top list because that could mean best, it could mean favorite, it could mean both. It's depends on how you want to do it. This time around, I've decided to do, I mean, a combination of both. In general, for me, the ones that I like the best are also the ones that I think the best, but that's not always the case. And so I'm sort of prioritizing what's making me happy right now, slightly above, what's critically acclaimed. But I want to talk about the methodology a little bit because what I really struggled with it was defining what a storyline is. So in my previous video, I had asked for recommendations, what people wanted to see, and Metarog had suggested this video. Thank you, Metarog. I appreciate it. And he said my top 10 storylines. And so I had to really think, what does storyline mean? I'm a regular poster on the Classic Comics forum, and at the Classic Comics forum we did a thing a couple years ago, I guess about 3 years ago now, where we counted down our top sagas. And so originally I thought when I was doing this video I could just take my list of top sagas and do that, but when I looked at it I realized that a saga and a storyline aren't necessarily the same thing, because there's a couple that are sort of longer sagas that have multiple storylines, and I don't think they really count. So for my top 10 sagas, there was a couple things I had to cut. Usagi Yojimbo is one that I had to cut. Grimjack is another one. I love both of those. They're my top 10 like broader stories, but they're really not like one storyline. On the other hand, I think there are some extended series that contain multiple storylines that also still count as a storyline. So what I mean as an example is, for instance, Neil Gaiman's Sandman has multiple arcs that are individual stories, but if you read it as a whole, it forms a bigger storyline. So that's something where I think you could cite the entire series as one storyline. When I think about that, what I'm looking for is if there is a through line, like if the whole broader story has a plot through line, but also like thematic and character arcs that build throughout the smaller stories to form one bigger like storyline. And that's something that, again, with Grimjack, I think you could argue like the first 40 some issues are one storyline. But the whole series as a whole, not so much. But I'm going to have a couple series on here on my list. That Heavenly Glow you see is my computer screen because I have it called up here. I'm going to be referring to it once in a while. There are a couple series on my list that are much bigger scale than what people typically think of as a storyline, but I'll argue as to why I think they deserve inclusion. The other thing is there were some that on the other hand, that are storylines, but they're so self-contained that I'm not sure they really fit the definition of a storyline so much as a story. For instance, Watchmen as a 12-issue story, if that was part of a broader series, that would be a storyline. But because it's completely self-contained, it feels more like a story than a storyline, if you understand what I'm saying. Like, to me, a storyline implies that there's like a continuity, a continuum that this is taking place in. Okay, I know everyone's already clicked the stop button on this video, but that's okay. I have down below the timing, so you can just skip to wherever you want as I count these down. The other thing is, I realized that when I cut out a couple that I didn't think fit the criteria, and I looked at my list, I realized that what's going to be my top 9 is very firm in terms of my top 9. But in terms of what's in that 10 spot, there's probably 10 to 12 storylines that are all about equal for me. And how I rank them from one day to the next is going to change. And I really had to think about what I enjoy as opposed to what I appreciate. For instance, Batman Year One, if I'm just going by my list, would be the next thing up on the list. And I really respect it. I love the art by David Mazzucchelli, but as much as I appreciate that storyline, I don't enjoy it that much because I'm not a big Batman fan. I am not really a big Frank Miller fan. And so I think it's a great work, but it doesn't bring me a lot of personal enjoyment. So right now, I'm going to give you a couple also rans that are storylines that I think most people may not even be aware of. I mean, there's some of the obvious things that almost made my top 10 are things like Ditko's Master Planner storyline in Amazing Spider-Man, or also Ditko in Strange Tales, the Eternity and Dormammu storyline, all-time classics, just missed my top 10. A couple that people probably aren't as familiar with that were close to my top 10 would be the first Shield arc in Strange Tales 135 to 141 is just great, just really great. The Kang Dynasty storyline, I think, is one of the best Avengers and one of the best superhero storylines of all time. That ran in Avengers Volume 3, number 41 to 54, I think. Really long, great storyline. And one that I really almost picked here as my number 10, but I guess in this list it would be number 11, is a series that I think hardly anyone's read, which is Strange Tales Volume 2. The Doctor Strange story there that runs in issues 1 to 18 is actually continued from Doctor Strange 79, 80, and 81. It leads into this 18-part storyline where Doctor Strange loses his powers because he calls on black magic, and so the forces that he normally calls on for white magic stop answering him, and so he basically has to become an apprentice to a black magician, the guy named Kalu, who was in the original Strange Tales series. That storyline is great. I mean, it's just fantastic. I love that storyline. Really underappreciated. But anyway, those are the things that didn't quite make it. And so here we are. I'm going to start in right now with my top 10 storylines of all time. And again, this number 10, catch me on a different day, I would have a different answer. But I'm going to say the Captain America No More storyline by Mark Grunwald and Chiron Dwyer. I'm leaving a space here so I can put some graphics on screen. That ran in Captain America 332 to 350. Absolutely love this storyline as it was coming out. I still holds up for me. I love it now. Every time I read it, it's great. I'm a big fan of Mark Grunwald's run on Captain America. And Marvel was doing a thing in the 80s. It's become a very common trope now, but in the 80s, they did this thing where their big three from the Avengers, and some of the other characters, but mainly big three, Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, they all were replaced. And basically the point of these stories is to show you why the person is the hero. It's not the powers, it's not the costume, it's the person wearing the costume. It's the human being, or in Thor's case, the god, that makes them special, and that other people in various ways don't measure up. So for me, of the all three of the Marvel ones are really, really good. But for me, the Captain America one is great. It's just the best. And then, of course, DC did the same thing with their big three in the early 90s, where they had Batman was replaced by Azrael, Superman was replaced by the Reign of the Supermen, Wonder Woman was replaced by Artemis. So it's a very common trope now. This is the first time I had encountered it. As a kid, I was reading this, and, well, I guess that's not true. I'd read some of the Iron Man first. But I just absolutely love this story. Just really, really great art, some great writing, and just really fun, great characterization, great, supporting cast, just across the board. Love that story. So, bit of a nostalgia pick for me, but also just I really think it still holds up. So that was my number 10. Again, some of those other ones I mentioned could have been number 10. You catch me at a different time on a different day. But that's the one that I'm going with today. So number 9, we're going to see a couple Avenger stories on my list. As I mentioned, the Kang Dynasty just missed. But coming in at number 9 for me is the Korvac Saga. which ran in Avengers numbers 167 through 177. There was a fill-in with 169. Jim Shooter doing the writing for most of it. George Perez doing the art for some of it. Absolutely love that storyline. The Guardians of the Galaxy are in it, and there's just Ultron shows up for part of it, but then you have the huge climax where Korvac kills the entire team, and it's so good. And there's also personal memories for me. My friend Jason and I were both collecting Avengers, and neither of us could find 177 as a back issue, and we had the whole rest of the story, and I'd read the entire story. It was probably at least a year, maybe close to 2 years before I finally got the last issue to see how it ended. And it was like, talk about cliffhangers, because this was in the 80s. You couldn't just find out. You had to find the issue. And so I was just like, every time I'd go to a comic shop trying to find Avengers 177 to see how the Korvac saga ended. Finally found it. Just so awesome. So great. So that's my number 9 for my top storylines of the Korvac saga. Okay. Coming in at number 8, it's The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck. Don't actually know the issue numbers this appeared in. It did appear in the regular comic. I first encountered it in this trade collection at a time when it was almost like sort of a legendary story because it had been out of print and the trade was incredibly expensive. And I'd heard about it, but of course I never had a chance to read it because you couldn't find it anywhere. And then I was at a flea market and there was someone that had 3 copies of it. So like a fool, I only bought 2 of them. I should have bought all 3 of them for $5 each. But I bought one for a friend, gave it to her, and then I kept one for myself, read it, and absolutely fantastic. The work that Don Rosa does in there, it seamlessly weaves in like every bit of continuity from the Carl Barks Uncle Scrooge stories. Every time he mentioned anything, Don Rosa put it together in this storyline, and it's just absolutely brilliant work. It's clearly a labor of love, and every individual story is fantastic. The arc as a whole is amazing, and then that's even without knowing the Barks stuff. I had never read the original Barks stories, so I was coming into this blind, and just totally blew me away. So if you have a chance to read The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck, highly recommend it. So good. Number 7 is another Avengers storyline that's an absolute favorite of mine, and this is a heavy nostalgia pick, but I've reread all of the Avengers storylines multiple times, and I just still think it holds up as the best Avengers story, my favorite Avengers story. It's the Mansion Siege storyline. Primarily ran in Avengers 271 and then 273 to 277. It crossed over into some other series, like Amazing Spider-Man, and a couple of others had some tie-ins, more tie-ins than crossovers. Storyline where the Masters of Evil have this plan to defeat the Avengers, and they bring in this huge horde of supervillains, and they all have very specific roles and specific jobs. Some of them don't even make it into the regular series because they're in these like sort of tie-ins, but they're still accomplishing things by like distracting a superhero over in their book so that they can't get to Avengers Mansion, whatever. The main storyline is really all you need to read, and it's so good. The Avengers get defeated. Avengers Mansion is overrun by the Masters of Evil. They capture Captain America and the Black Knight and Jarvis, and the only Avenger, Hercules, is almost beaten to death. The only Avenger who escapes the trap is the Wasp, who's the team's leader at the time. And she basically cobbles together this makeshift team of reservists to help her save the team. And it's got like Scott Lang, Ant-Man, and then she brings in Thor, and Captain Marvel manages to escape the dimension she was trapped in, and they recapture the mansion. And at the end of the story, everyone's basically sort of been taken out, and it's just Captain America and Baron Zemo man to man. It's just, and the character moments, it's absolutely great. Just so good. It's the superhero comics the way they should be. So yeah, just Absolutely love that. So NumberSix, here's a series that most people maybe aren't familiar with. It's called Box Office Poison. This was late 90s for me, is one of the high points in comics history. I know the 90s get a really bad rap, but for me, the late 90s, there was this huge resurgence after the near collapse of the industry, this creative resurgence, and many, we're going to see some more on my list, but many of my favorite comics and titles and storylines of all time were all happening in the same little window. I would go to the comic store and I'd be getting 3 or 4 or 5 issues, each time at the comic store, and they would all be of like my favorite storylines of all time. And there's some of the series I wasn't reading at the time that I've since picked up, and they're just fantastic. And so Box Office Poison is a series that is, it's an indie sort of slice of life book, and it absolutely just hit me right at my core. Like, the experiences that it was clearly based on some very personal experiences by the creator, Alex Robinson, and they were so close to my own. There's 2 main characters. One of them is a struggling writer. He has aspirations to be this great writer, but he's actually just sort of stuck in this dead-end job working at a bookstore. That was exactly my situation when I started reading the book. I wanted to be a writer, but I was working at a bookstore. And then his best friend is this sort of nerdy, shy comic book geek who really wants to work in comics. And he's a struggling artist, and he has this dream. He just loves comics, and he's like socially awkward. And that was also me. And basically we follow the story, the 2 of them, and there's a great like supporting cast. And Ed, the comic book nerd, ends up becoming an apprentice to an embittered Golden Age artist who's sort of based kind of on Jack Kirby, but also on some of the other Golden Age artists who got screwed. And so there's a whole like comic book themed story plot line to it about the comics industry, but also just some great personal stuff and character work, and just really hit me. So I love that series, recommend it to anybody, and Box Office Poison is my number 6. Number 5, the first Marvel series I ever read, my first Marvel comic was Thor 350, right in the middle of Walt Simonson's Surtur Saga, so that's my number 5. The best Thor story of all time, in my opinion. One of the pinnacles of Marvel Comics. One of the great stories of the 80s. It's just absolutely amazing from start to finish. I came in right at the peak of the Surtur Saga. Simonson art, Simonson writing. Just the lettering's tremendous. The word balloons. It's just like, it's its whole own thing. And that's how I got introduced to like superheroes. Is I started buying Thor for the fantasy elements, and then during this storyline, the Fantastic Four and the Avengers guest star in it, and I was just hooked. And I highly recommend anybody. Simonson did some great storylines after this, before the end of his run. The whole storyline with a Scourge. When they go into hell to rescue the mortals that have been trapped there, that storyline is amazing. And then when he fights Jormungand, the World Serpent, it's just some great stuff later. But the Surtur Saga is the heart of it. It's my pick, number 5, my top storylines. Number 4, another childhood pick that I still go back to. It still holds up for me, and I just think it's a masterpiece, and that is the original ElfQuest, numbers 1 through 20. I first encountered it in the Dawning Starblaze graphic novel collections, a 4-volume set that I first encountered it in the Epic reprint series, which ran 32 issues, and I was somewhere around issue 6 or 7 when I was at a bookstore, and I discovered that what I was reading was reprints, and I could get the rest of the series right then. So why wait? Another 3 years for Epic to finish reprinting the series when I could get it in color immediately? So that's what I did. I bought volumes 2, 3, and 4, read the whole story. blew my mind and still does. I haven't read all of the Elf. There's just like so much ElfQuest that came after that, and to me, there's sort of diminishing returns, and it just sort of gets kind of diffused. They bring in other creators, and it's just sort of some of it's good and some of it's okay. But what you really need to read is just that original 20-issue series. It's just fantastic, just so good. So that's my number 4. Number 3, I have Bone. The original series, I think, ran 55 issues. I've read it in the complete 1-volume Bone. I realize in some ways this doesn't exactly fit in the criteria I put at the beginning. You know, like, can see how you might think if this qualifies, why wouldn't something like Watchmen? Doesn't matter, I like this better than Watchmen anyway. And it's just, you know, it has individual arcs in it, but you have to read the thing as a whole. You got to read the whole thing to really get it, because the way I describe it is if you can imagine Huey, Dewey, and Louie in The Lord of the Rings, that's Bone. It's got just the humor and the heart and the drawing style of like a Carl Barks or Don Rosa Duck book, but the storyline, once you get into it, it initially seems like it's just sort of a humor story, but it starts building these threads, and it turns out it's actually this epic, amazing high fantasy saga. Totally love it. And I think, you know, it's a modern masterpiece. Again, it's one of these books that was coming out in the 90s. I think it started in 94, so mid-late 90s, all through the late 90s and in the early 2000s. And my top 3 are all late 90s series. So again, 90s gets a bad rap, but I'm here to tell you I've read a lot of comics, and from all different eras, and the late 90s just had so many great comics. Coming in at number 2, it's Starman, the whole series, number 0 through number 80. Yes, they're individual arcs, and some of those are really good self-contained stories. He sort of starts to lose the self-contained story things in the individual arcs about halfway through. But right from the beginning, it's clear he's setting up a longer storyline with the main character, Jack. And that goes all the way through issue 80, and it's when you read the whole thing, it's got the beginning, the middle, the end, the character development, the arc of Jack, from basically kind of an a-hole at the beginning to like a true caring person and hero at the end of the series, is fantastic. And then James Robinson, the writer, weaves in just these amazing bits of DC continuity that don't seem to have anything to do with each other. He's mainly focused on the Starman, so he's got all these different Starman characters. Basically everyone who's ever gone by the name Starman or Starboy or some combination of Stargirl, they're all involved in this storyline, and we get stories about all of them. We get the Starman of the 1970s, and you get but a bunch of other characters that don't seem to really fit in the universe are major players. You get one of the Charity, who is the host of like Forbidden Mansion or something like that. And then you get John Valor, the Black Pirate, who's a Golden Age character. You get characters like Solomon Grundy is the main character for a while, and Black Condor. Did I get his name right? I'm not even sure. You get characters like the Elongated Man comes in for an extended part. And the Shade, of course, old Flash villain, is one of the main characters in the series. And oh, I forgot to mention, it's got not Tomahawk, but Scalp Hunter. I don't know why I just blanked on that. Scalp Hunter turns out to be a major character in the series. It's so good. It's so good. It does have a lot of, it feels very 90s in terms of the character stuff, like late 90s, swingers. That's kind of who Jack is. So he's sort of like pre-hipster. If you lived through the 90s, you know the type of person I'm talking about. So some people find him very annoying, but he's sort of intentionally annoying at the beginning of the series, and just stick with it. I mean, it's got everything. It's got This, the Starman from Adventure Comics is in it. There's a whole trip to space where he goes back in time and meets Jor-El, and he meets Space Cabbie. Like, all these just great, and it just all ties together. It's so good. So that's my number 2. And my number 1, my favorite comic of all time, similar in some ways to Starman, in terms of weaving together DC continuity in unexpected and amazing ways. Sandman Mystery Theater, numbers 1 to 70. There's also an annual and a special where it crosses over with Neil Gaiman's Sandman, which is a key story. This I'm gonna do a whole podcast about this at some point. I absolutely love everything about the series. Guy Davis, incredible artwork. Matt Wagner, Steven Seagal, the writers, just some tremendous stories. There's 4-issue arcs throughout. So the whole series is 4 issues all the way to the end, and then the last arc is 2 issues. And it's brilliant the way that they end the series, in my opinion. And the arcs, they're each self-contained story, but they continue to build, particularly from a character standpoint, because the storyline is really about Wesley Dodds and Diane Belmont and how they sort of come together. And I have some theories about it. It's just incredibly rich. To me, the best relationship depiction in all of comics, the relationship between those 2 characters. Each arc, it goes back and forth from the point of view of whether it's from her point of view or his point of view, and just fantastic. And it brings in all of this, at the time this was coming out in the 90s, in DC continuity, Sandman was considered the first superhero. So, this was post-crisis, so Superman wasn't around back then. So it was Sandman who was considered the first superhero. And so this storyline, it's this gritty crime noir series. It's set in like 1938, 1939 New York. So it's very pulp. And you see all the earliest characters of the DC universe slowly seep in. And the superhero elements are there, but they're sort of minor background because it is a crime drama. It's very realistic in terms of the superhero elements. But you get like Hourman and the Crimson Avenger, and you see Ted Knight before he becomes Starman when he's still working on the Cosmic Rod, and it's other characters like that. And just some great continuity stuff for nerds like us. But it's really the character stuff, the relationship, the character arc with Wesley and Diane is just great. I thought the ending was brilliant. I don't want to spoil anything. Because I'm gonna do a whole separate thing where I spoil it. But if you haven't read Sandman Mystery Theater, for my money, my favorite comic of all time, just absolutely fantastic. So there it is, my top 10 storylines. There's lots and lots of other storylines that I really love. Of course, the first time we did this top 100 sagas thing for the Classic Comics Forum, I actually did a top 100 list. This time I only did a top 50, but I've ranked them out, and of course I've read other stuff since then. There was a few romance ones I thought about including, like the David and Eileen storyline in Just Married number 93 to 101 is a personal favorite, but didn't quite make my top 10. There's some really cool Archie storylines in Jughead. Jughead Jones' Semi-Private Eye is a great storyline. But anyway, enough about my also rans. If someone really wants, I'll do another video about some of those. But there it is. I hope you enjoyed my top 10 storylines. Let me know what you think. Let me know what your favorite stories are. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.